Hey everyone, this is a piece from Marcel Stoetzler's edited anthology Critical Theory and the Critique of Antisemitism. This piece is titled The Critical Theory of Antisemitism and the Limits of Enlightenment by Jordi Maiso. Translated by Alex Alvarez Taylor. An awareness of the significance and reach of modern anti-Semitism is central to the process of development of Adorno and Horkheimer's critical theory. Reflecting on the persecution of Jews and its social consequences was of fundamental importance to the reformulation of their theoretical project in the early 1940s. The first tangible result of which were visible in Dialectic of Enlightenment. Rather than an isolated phenomenon, critical theory regards anti-Semitism as the product of a determinate socio-historical constellation. Instead of focusing attention on the phenomenon as such, understanding anti-Semitism requires consideration of the whole social nexus within which anti-Semitism proliferates. In this sense, anti-Semitism played a key intellectual role, allowing critical theory to keep critical theory's finger on the pulse of a modern society that had left the bourgeois liberal world behind. It offered a sophisticated and comprehensive perspective on the ways in which a specific tension between domination and emancipation had emerged historically. In practice, the increasingly virulent persecution of Jews not only in Nazi Germany became a yardstick for gauging the currency of modernity's emancipatory expectations and for recalibrating the priorities of a critical theory of society. The reality of anti-Semitism demands that one take stock of the, quote, limits of enlightenment, end quote. Detlef Clausen, 2005. As indicated by the title of the 5th chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, the iconic key text of the critical theory of anti-Semitism, Elements of Anti-Semitism, Limits of Enlightenment. There's a footnote here. The present text is deeply indebted to the work of Jose Antonio Zamora and to our collaboration over the past 15 years. I'm also grateful to Alex Alvarez Taylor for translating the text into English. Okay. Indeed, the persecution of Jews, which many considered a residue from the Dark Middle Ages, did not disappear in the so-called Age of Enlightenment. It revealed an undercurrent of irrationality and violence that had never been fully addressed in modern societies, and which could flare up again at any time. Even the darkest prognoses of the time paled in comparison with the news of the planned and systematic extermination of European Jews, which Adorno came to associate with a place name, quote, Auschwitz, end quote, the German name for a town in Poland that simultaneously implies an entire process and infrastructure of annihilation. In Adorno's words, the events at Auschwitz shed, quote, a deathly livid light, end quote, on the history of civilization as a whole. The Nazi policy of extermination, conceived as the, quote, final solution of the Jewish question, end quote, appeared as the culmination of the history of modern anti-Semitism and forced critical theory to reflect on the failed promises of assimilation, on the intensification of forms of violence, and their escalation at the heart of modern European civilization itself. Just a side note from myself, I took a course on Nazi Germany, and this is this is important for discussing critical theory. I don't know in what way it's important, but it was emphasized in that course that large parts of the Holocaust were not perpetrated in extermination camps. There's a concept of the Holocaust by bullets, where Jews were kind of just rounded up and shot as opposed to, systematically forced through a death factory. Not to take away from the importance of what Auschwitz symbolizes, but it's something to consider when talking about the Holocaust in general. Anyway, For anti-Semitism was not something that plagued Western democracies as if from without. The extermination of the Jews had been planned and tolerated in the countries of Central Europe in a culture that supposedly upheld the principles of law, reason, and order. This epochal constellation led Horkheimer and Adorno to assume that, quote, the Jews are today the group which in practice and in theory draws to itself the destructive urge which the wrong social order spontaneously produces, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Accompanying the rise of fascism, the recrudescence of anti-Semitism demanded a renewed awareness of the need to rethink critical theory's position on the course of history. As early as August 1940, at the outset of the collaborative effort that culminated in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno wrote to Horkheimer, quote, I often have the feeling that everything we were used to seeing from the standpoint of the proletariat would today have been conferred on the Jews in a terribly concentrated form. I wonder, whether we should not speak of the things we really want to say in relation to the Jews who today represent the polar opposite of the concentration of power, end quote. Adorno. Naturally, this does not have to imply that Jews ought to replace the proletariat as those to whom the theory is addressed or as the privileged subject of history. It's not a question of attributing to the category of, quote, the Jews, end quote, the power that would be needed to constitute a political subject capable of articulating the promise of an emancipated society. What the Jewish perspective allows for is a corrective to the understanding of history held by some more, quote, traditional, end quote, currents of Marxism. Such a perspective aims to act against the triumphal basis that causes social movements to cling to the radiant promise of a, quote, final victory, end quote, always shining in the distant future instead of attending to the devastation wrought by the failures of the present. This means doing justice to the categorical imperative of a young Marx who demanded, quote, the overthrow of all social relations that reduce the human being to the condition of a degraded, enslaved, helpless, and despised creature. Nevertheless, under the new historical conditions, quote, overthrowing social relations, end quote, seems to have become a distant goal. For this reason, Adorno's later formulation of the imperative is far more modest. Quote, Hitler has imposed a new categorical imperative upon the human beings in the state of their unfreedom, to arrange their thinking and actions so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar ever happens again, end quote. Occasionally it has been alleged that the critical theory of anti-Semitism is incapable of accounting for the specificity of the violence and discrimination to which Jews are subjected in comparison with other forms of, quote, prejudice, end quote. See Lars Rensman, 2017, and Eva Maria Siga, 2009. However, this criticism overlooks that critical theory enables not only the identification of affinities between anti-Semitism and other forms of discriminatory violence, but also allows for their integration within a social theory that accounts for the social and psychic constitution of subjects and thereby seeks to account for the specificity of persecution of Jews. The figure of the Jew appears as the scapegoat par excellence. For fascism, Jews are not merely a minority, but, quote, the negative principle as such, end quote, the destruction of which salvation depends upon. This call for an analysis of the ways in which National Socialist anti-Semitism, which culminates in extermination, emerges out of the modern form of anti-Semitism. This modern iteration is itself informed by a 1,000-year-long tradition of persecuting Jews on a religious basis, hence the need to consider the social conflict in which the modern form of anti-Semitism appears and reproduces itself. Throughout much of European and before that Mediterranean history, Jews have been the social group most associated with the issue of hatred towards, quote, the other, end quote, or, quote, the strangers, end quote. Nevertheless, the idea of a, quote, eternal anti-Semitism, end quote, is misleading. Rather than positing it as an ahistorical constant, the task of any social theory worth its salt is to explain how anti-Semitism takes root ever anew and differently within concrete socio-historical situations. Detlef Clausen, 1987. For this reason, critical theory recognizes that an adequate understanding of anti-Semitism demands a theory capable of relating the analysis of the objective constitution of society with the ways in which subjects are constituted within and by society, taking into consideration the pressures that cause subjects. Despite all the advances made by civilization to continue maintaining a, quote, archaic disposition towards violence, end quote. Only such general framing can produce a meaningful social theory of anti-Semitism as a specific phenomenon. Anti-Semitism and the dialectic of the process of civilization. Firstly, for critical theory, anti-Semitism plays a key role in accounting for the dialectic of the civilizational process. Quote, as a rebellion against civilization, fascism is not simply the reoccurrence of the archaic, but the archaic's reproduction in and by civilization itself. End quote, Adorno. For this reason, anti-Semitism is not to be viewed as a marginal phenomenon. Rather, analysis of anti-Semitism can reveal substantive elements within the constitution of the social order. And now it implies the eruption of the latent potentials of oppression and repression accumulated in its history. According to Horkheimer and Adorno, anti-Semitic violence expresses the revolt of a repressed, deformed, and prohibited mimetic impulse against domination. What is peculiar about this form of violence is that such a rebellion of oppressed nature finally ends up serving to perpetuate domination itself. How is this to be explained? Anti-Semites often justify their hostility towards Jews in idiosyncratic terms, as a spontaneous, almost somatic, irrepressible kind of aversion, one that in the face of specific triggers can result in a violent and defensive response. Nevertheless, Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis inverts the argument. Instead of regarding the specific characteristics or behavior of Jews as the cause of idiosyncratic reactions, as the logic of victim-blaming mentality would have one infer, one ought to locate the root of the problem in the wounds and deformations that the civilizational logic produced in specific subjects, ones that predispose them to have strongly adverse reactions when confronted with certain stimuli. Notably here is the severity of the reaction when the behavior of characteristics exhibited resemble living nature, a nature not completely subdued, since such a nature recalls the painful memory of everything that had to be repressed throughout the process of adaptation. This explains the repulsion felt by anti-Semites when confronted with the attributes they impute to Jews: mimetic behavior, undisciplined gesturality, unrestrained expressiveness, a corporality that evokes the animal element, something primary and partially beyond dominant hygiene norms. Definitively, quote, whatever is not quite assimilated or infringes the commands in which the progress of centuries has been sedimented is felt as intrusive and arouses a compulsive aversion, end quote. The memory of such elements reveals the coercive quality of a civilizational process that demands that subjects submit to a lamentable logic of hardening and discipline. The fictive projections of anti-Semites, the perverse fantasies with which anti-Semites represent their victims, allow one to recognize everything that has been proscribed and excluded from civilization. Quote, those blinded by civilization have contact with their own tabooed mimetic traits, only through certain gestures and forms of behavior they encounter in others as isolated shameful residues in their rationalized environment. End quote. By this token, the idiosyncratic rejection of Jews helps to indicate, as it were, the quote, sore, end quote, spots of modernity where the failed promises of civilization become evident. The rage that is discharged in anti-Semitic aggression functions by projecting hatred onto that which is repressed. Its strength derives from tapping into a deep well of frustration. Such frustration progressively accumulated under the weight of civilizational coercion, which imposed discipline and restrictions upon subjects but never managed to fulfill any of its promises to them. For this reason, it is argued that, quote, anti-Semitism is a well-rehearsed pattern, indeed a ritual of civilization, and the pogroms are the true ritual murders, end quote. Anything that seems to have escaped coercion, anything that recalls cheated happiness, must fall under the same repressive yoke as that suffered by, quote, civilized, end quote, subjects, the same yoke that gives the lie to the claim of having arrived at a truly civilized state. Deep down, repressed subjects, quote, always go short economically and sexually, end quote, and therefore, quote, hate without end. They find relaxation unbearable because they do not know fulfillment, end quote. In this sense, domination can only subsist insofar as the dominated, quote, turn what they yearn for into an object of hate, end quote. The precarious position of the Jews, who in spite of their outsider status seem to embody the image of powerless happiness, undermines the tiresome task of adapting to the world as it is, turning them into ideal targets for resentment. Nietzsche's influence is felt in such analyses. Nietzsche writes of how accumulated frustration can turn into an aggressive impulse that seeks to, quote, sanctify revenge with the term justice, end quote. Ultimately, the persistence of anti-Semitism reveals that the current social order, quote, really cannot exist without defiguring human beings. The persecution of the Jews, like persecution as such, cannot be separated from that order. The persecution of the Jews' essence, however, it may hide itself at times, is the violence which today is openly revealed. Oh, sorry, I think I confused some words there. Ultimately, the persistence of anti-Semitism reveals the current social order, quote, really cannot exist without defiguring human beings. The persecution of the Jews, like persecution as such, cannot be separated from that order. Its essence, however, it may hide itself at times as the violence which today is openly revealed, end quote. Adopting Freudian terms, one might argue that for the anti-Semite, the figure of the Jew embodies the ambivalence of unheimliche. That is, to the extent that he embodies the picture of repulsion before a strangeness that is nevertheless perturbingly familiar. This representation indicates that all has been repressed in the name of establishing, quote, the identical purpose-directed masculine character, end quote, of the subject, which requires every other individual, quote, to inflict terrible injuries, end quote, on him or herself. We're hammering a door now. The dynamic of anti-Semitic reaction shows that civilizational control has proven incapable of mastery. There remain instinctual forms of reaction before the menacing forces of nature. For example, the spasms of skin, muscles, and members, as well as gestures and forms of mimetic behavior that imply, quote, touching, nestling, soothing, coaxing, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. The advance of civilization implies a certain distancing from such behavioral logics. In dialectic of enlightenment, magic is characterized as the conscious use of mimesis. Thus, it is through mimesis itself that rationality paves its own way, culminating in exclusively objectifying forms of behavior, work, rational action. For this is required a discipline that seeks to harden the self to prevent the self from dissolving back into surrounding nature. Consequently, the promise of happiness announced in every conscious relationship with nature must be repressed, for it implies sacrificing the distance upon which the strong self is based. An increasingly rigid subject is established through opposition to any form of gentle adaptation towards nature. Thus, the blind and coercive attributes of mimetic behavior are prolonged by the social domination of nature. Quote, all that remains of the adaptation to nature is the hardening against it. End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Since there exists the desire to forget the horror against which mimesis was originally reacting, and which rational praxis seems to have successfully escaped, both mimetic behavior and anything that might remind us of horror become taboo. Yet such a repressive dynamic proves fatal for rationality, since it prevents itself from becoming conscious of the regressive elements that persist in it. Everything that is archaic, backwards, and anachronistic, everything that recalls the old domination and primitive forms of defensive response, arouses derision and anger. All these things are living reminders of the enduring violence that continues to hold sway over the relations of production. Yet it is a violence to which civilized beings must submit and which they must try to forget in order to live. Rationalized idiosyncrasy is thus directed against the unmastered mimetic impulse. The repressed returns in its image. The forbidden desire to let go, to lose oneself in a state of nature, is given free rein in the controlled anarchy of the pogrom. In violence towards the vulnerable and stigmatized, particularly since such violence serves to eliminate this same desire. The lure of the forbidden turns into rage and violence against weakness in those who struggle to achieve awareness of their own renunciations and sacrifice, since such an awareness would threaten the coercive adaptation that ensures survival. Persecution, however, is unleashed not only against those in a vulnerable position, but in particular against those who are perceived to have eluded the social norm from which the majority proved unable to escape. The idiosyncratic aversion that may give way to the violent response is underpinned by a mechanism of projection. Hence Horkheimer and Adorno's conclusion, quote, this mechanism needs the Jews. Their artificially heightened visibility acts on the legitimate son of Gentile civilization like a kind of magnetic field. In being made aware, through his very difference from the Jew, of the humanity they have in common, the rooted Gentile is overcome by a feeling of something antithetical and alien. ... It makes little difference whether the Jews as individuals really display the mimetic traits which cause the malign infection, or whether those traits are merely imputed. End quote. The only thing that matters is that their position may serve as a suitable and functional screen for such projection. According to this line of reasoning, for anti-Semites, the figure of the Jew is little more than a screen onto which to project repressed psychic material. All the excesses and crimes attributed to, quote, the Jews, end quote, since time immemorial, from infanticide to conspiracies and well poisonings, are nothing but the projection of the taboo desires that populate the dark night of repressive civilization. The craving for, quote, exclusive ownership, appropriation, unlimited power at any price, end quote. They attribute to their victims what they must restrain in themselves. This false projection is, quote, the antithesis of genuine mimesis, end quote. Instead of doing justice to the reconciliatory dimensions of mimesis in the subject, the false projection is fed by the repression of mimesis, which is put at the service of paranoid delusion. Quote, the person chosen as foe is already perceived as foe, end quote. But the mechanisms of repression and paranoid projection are not simply the internal mechanisms of the psychic economy, but those of civilization. The totalitarian order does nothing more than put them at its service. The insanity of the paranoid type reduces the external world to a reflection of his delusions of grandeur and persecution. And the paranoid type's fear imagines a gigantic danger that corresponds to these delusions. Thus, the paranoid type's dreamed omnipotence is a surrogate, the repetition of an empty scheme, for which all objects are equal and interchangeable. Since self-perception and reflection are absent, reality is degraded to a sphere for applying schemas. Fascism's destructive impulse is nothing but a developed form of fascism's own inability to deal with difference. One moment. Antisemitism and the dialectic of bourgeois emancipation. At the outset of modernity, Jews found themselves in an uncomfortable situation. On the one hand, Jews were subject to the protection of, quote, emperors, princes, or the absolutist state, end quote. As Horkheimer indicated, projection is the original form of domination, though since it leaves the protected at the mercy of the arbitrary goodwill of the protector. On the other hand, Jews were the group on which the anger and frustration of the population were vented. Persecution obliged them to seek positions from which they could gain influence in order to survive and improve their economic situation. This led some Jewish individuals into highly visible roles in an increasingly monetarized economy that would ultimately make way for the logic of capitalism, creating a perception of, quote, the Jews, end quote, as economic modernizers and turning them into objects of increased hatred. They were perceived to be, and accused of being, beneficiaries of, quote, the economic progress which today is their downfall, end quote, by the, quote, craftsmen and farmers whose status capitalism undermined, end quote. Dominant groups benefited from their position as alleged, quote, colonizers of progress, end quote, reaping the fruits of the modernization process and accepting that the fury of the population that bore its brunt would periodically flare up and address itself towards, quote, the Jews, end quote. Pogroms represented a break with taboo, quote, a permitted or rather ordered excess, the festive transgression of a prohibition, end quote. They were tolerated. If they were tolerated, it was because they served to internalize the violence of domination. Hence, Adorno and Horkheimer speak of anti-Semitism as, quote, a luxury for the common people, end quote. The Christian tradition, which presented Jews as, quote, Christ killers, end quote, offered a justificatory narrative for such assaults, basing itself on a long tradition of animosity and recriminations. As Horkheimer and Adorno pointed out, this was conducive even in the secularized societies of the 20th century. Quote, to accuse the Jews of being obdurate unbelievers is no longer enough to incite the masses, but the religious hostility which motivated the prosecution of the Jews for two millennia is far from completely extinguished. Rather, anti-Semitism's eagerness to deny its religious tradition indicates that tradition is secretly no less deeply embedded in as secular idiosyncrasy once was in religious zealotry. End quote. But if the Jews become the primary object of resentment, it is above all because of their perception as representatives of the sphere of economic circulation or exchange. Quote, trade was not their vocation, but their destiny, end quote. A destiny to which a centuries-long tradition of persecution had consigned them. It was this aspect that from the 19th century onwards allowed the Jews to appear as the great beneficiaries of incipient capitalism. The expansion of the spheres of circulation, commerce, and the liberal professions were perceived by many as an expansion of the Jewish sphere of influence. But while some Jews seemed to gain from the new social order, in collective terms, Jews remained vulnerable. In this sense, it is the Enlightenment promise of emancipation that allowed anti-Semitism to become a key to understanding the contradictions of liberal bourgeois society. From the very beginning, the promise of emancipation was regarded as being conditional on the requirement of assimilation. The Jews had to renounce their own history to participate in abstract equality as citizen subjects with rights and obligations. But in 1789, Clermont-Tonnerre pointed out that, quote, Jews as a nation must be denied everything. Jews as human beings must be granted everything. End quote. See Detlef Clausen, 1987. To the extent that assimilation required Jews to renounce their history and the specificity that distinguished Jews in an embrace of the bourgeois subject's abstract universality, the ideals of freedom, equality, and humanity to which they aspired proved to be empty husks. Adorno himself would also point out the, quote, totalitarian and particularistic, end quote, character of bourgeois universality. In fact, pre-bourgeois forms of domination were characterized by a relatively overt character, legitimized as those pre-bourgeois forms of domination were, according to the division of the estates and a religious worldview. Within this order, Jews occupied an extraterritorial position in which they figured either as objects of protection or persecution, depending on the case in question. In contrast, the abstract forms of domination that arise with capitalist social relations depend for their legitimation upon an abstract universality that is to be extended to every human being, a schema in which freedom and equality are understood in purely formal terms. According to the aforementioned logic, hoping for emancipation meant accepting an assimilatory requirement that was not without consequences. Quote, the enlightened self-control with which adapted Jews effaced within themselves the painful scars of domination by others, a kind of second circumcision made them forsake their own dilapidated community and wholeheartedly embrace the life of the modern bourgeoisie, which was already advancing ineluctably toward a reversion to pure oppression. End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Such a process leads to Jews becoming the ideal target for the frustrations generated under the novel forms of abstract domination. Paradoxically, in the end, the Jews were charged with paying the price of failure to make good on the promises of the bourgeois revolutions in which a large part of the population had placed their hopes. Expropriated of their history and reduced to mere owners of commodities, Jews became objects of hate, and so modern anti-Semitism was born. In Detlef Clausen's terms, its emergence stems from the failure to achieve emancipation in the wake of the Revolution and subsequent Napoleonic Wars. Modern anti-Semitism's rise ought to be understood as a response to the French Revolution and the French Revolution's socio-economic consequences. As Jews left the ghettos and began ascending socially in the emerging capitalist order, especially within the so-called liberal professions, and particularly if baptized, they became the targets of widespread resentment. This took place within the aggravating context of the capitalist valorization process, in which relations of domination and servitude could no longer be explained in terms of direct personal relations, but in terms of the process of abstract universal mediation based on the production and exchange of commodities. No longer overt social domination manifested itself in anonymous and objectified imperatives, in what Marx called the, quote, mute compulsion of economic relations, end quote. One issue with the impersonal character of capitalist domination is that underlying the apparent outward rationality of the exchange mediation lie coercive and violent social relations that increasingly exacerbate conditions of inequality. Jews, as the only recognizable representatives of the sphere of circulation, were identified with the everyday mechanism of exchange and the frustrations resulting from it, which affected the vast majority of the population. Since they were identified with money, Jews as a whole came to be regarded as personifications of the abstract mechanisms of valorization. They came to be perceived as being responsible for the preponderance of impersonal forms of social power. In this respect, quote, anti-Semitism becomes abstract, end quote. Clausen. Nevertheless, this development never spared Jews from being scapegoated for the implacable injustices of the economic system. They were depicted as being as destructive, powerful, and international as capitalism itself. Richard Wagner, in a text from 1850 called Judaism in Music, would even go so far as to name Jews as the real, quote, dominators, end quote. Footnote. Just like that, the creditor of kings, Gläubiger der Könige, has become the king of the pious, König der Gläubigen. And we cannot regard the emancipatory claim of this king as anything but erroneously naive, for it is we who find ourselves in the need of emancipation from the Jews. In the current state of affairs, the Jew is already more than emancipated. The Jew dominates, and will continue to dominate as long as money remains the moment before which our activity loses all its strength. End quote. End footnote. Wagner, quoted in Clausen, 1987. End footnote. The practical function such an argument serves is in reproducing new forms of domination is obvious. Quote, that is why people shout, quote, stop thief, end quote, and point at the Jew. He is indeed the scapegoat, not only for the individual maneuvers and machinations, but in the wider sense that the economic injustice of the whole class is attributed to the Jew. End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Anti-Semitism and the dialectic of the commodity form. The specificity of capitalism's social constitution is owed to the fact that within capitalism, domination takes the form of a process of social mediation in which it assumes an increasingly abstract and anonymous appearance. While its coercive moment is indeed tangible, the logic that governs the social system is not easily identifiable. There is no palpable embodiment of what Marx defined as the, quote, automatic subject, end quote. What the social constitution generates is an ensemble of deceptive appearances that prevent us from unraveling the web of social mediations. According to Marx's analysis of the commodity form, individuals perceive the social relation individuals establish with one another in exchange as a, quote, natural characteristic, end quote, of the commodities traded. In other words, what makes commodities exchangeable appears to be an inherent quality of the commodities themselves. However, as Marx makes clear, this interchangeability derives from the social structure of the specific form taken by social relations in commodity-producing society, and is within this structure that an inversion takes place, one between social relations and the manifest attributes or qualities of things. This in turn means that the, quote, suprasensible, end quote, and social dimension of the commodity comes to present itself as an inherent attribute of the commodity itself. For Adorno, there is no doubt that social objectivity, as an antagonistic totality, constitutes a real unity that embraces everything. It is characterized above all by a dynamic of quid pro quo, in which social objectivity is constituted as an autonomous entity, vis-a-vis the individuals who keep it ticking over. The world of capital is an inverted world. The world of capital is constituted thanks to the actions with which individuals ensure its reproduction. Yet as it grows increasingly independent from the individuals that constitute it, it develops its own dynamic. Such a dynamic obeys laws that operate, as it were, quote, behind the backs, end quote, of individuals, weighing on individuals as, quote, alien, end quote, a, quote, alien, end quote, autonomous force. Both Marx and Adorno note that this description ought to be understood in ironic terms, especially since their theorizations of society, above all, are designed to criticize and challenge the autonomization of the social synthesis, revealing the sore spot of persisting heteronomy in the capitalist social system. Such heteronomy stems from the fact that individuals are simultaneously both subjects and objects. The system is indeed constituted by their actions. However, the system crystallizes in a pseudo-objectified logic that coercively confronts individuals and turns individuals into mere executors and appendages of the social dynamic they have set in motion. In this way, critical theory avoids either falling back into a form of positivism that renders a reified objectivity absolute by obscuring that reified objectivity's genesis, or turning into a sociology of interaction that hypostatizes and takes at face value the form of appearance of individuals in existing society, acting but atomized individuals. The existing social organization prevents, though, the individual's constitution as true subjects. Traditional, i.e., quote, non-critical, end quote, sociology, in either its positivist or action-theoretical versions, posits the autonomized form of social objectivity as both external and opposed to the subjects, as a fixed reality whose genesis has become almost impenetrable and impossible for individuals to grasp. The individuals tend not to take for granted the process of societal structures. The individuals tend not to take for granted the process of social structures, the capital relations autonomization, even if the real abstraction of the sum of exchange values is nothing other than autonomized reification of their labor as a whole. Marx's value theory intended to lay bare the reasons why individuals act the way they do without knowing what they do. By exchanging the products of their labor as equivalent values, they are in fact equating different labors with one another, however in a non-conscious manner. The money form makes possible the reconstruction of a real abstraction or a really existing universal. However, since the genesis of this universal is no longer visible, it is perceived as something existing in itself, as a quality or attribute of the object, and not as the result of the subject's activity. Adorno denounces the logical connection between value, money, and capital as indicative of the growing irrationalization of society. Quote, society, that which has become autonomous, is no longer comprehensible. Only the law of society's autonomization is comprehensible. Incomprehensibility refers not only to its essential structure, but also to ideology, end quote. The sum of value amounts to a, quote, real abstraction, end quote. But this is nothing less than the autonomization of abstract labor. In the capital form, fetishized cognition introduces a split between the natural materiality of labor and its products on the one hand, and money and interest on the other. Since money and interest come to be perceived by participants as abstract and separate, money and interest become the sole target of denunciation. For Marx, interest originates in the surplus value wrested from living labor. Yet this connection is concealed by the fetish character of commodities, money and capital. Quote, it is in interest-producing capital that the automatic fetish, as self-valorizing value, as money that begets more money, becomes visible in all its purity, and in this form no longer shows any scar of how it was generated, end quote. Marx's critique of the fetishism of capital is thus directed towards the exploitative core of the ensemble of social relations subjected to its form. Its aim is to unmask the imposed subject-object inversion. In listing the Marxian critique of fetishism in Elements of Antisemitism, Adorno and Horkheimer used the term, quote, the true Shylock, quote, der wahre Shylock, to describe the capitalist proprietor of the means of production as the, quote, true, end quote, usurer, in contrast to the merchant and the banker. Quote, the capitalist proprietor grabbed not only from the market but from the source, as a functionary of the class system. The capitalist proprietor took care not to go short of the fruits of his workers' labor. The workers had to deliver as much as possible. As the true Shylock, the capitalist proprietor insisted on his banknote, bracket, shine, end bracket. By virtue of owning the machines and materials, the capitalist proprietor forced the others to produce. The capitalist proprietor called himself the producer, but the capitalist proprietor and everyone secretly knew the truth. The productive work of the capitalist, whether the capitalist justified his profit as the reward of the enterprise, as under liberalism, or as the director's salary, as today, was the ideology which concealed the nature of the labor contract and the rapacity of the economic system. End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Like those who, cheated out of receiving fair compensation for their labor power, are unable to locate the source of deceit other than in the sphere of circulation, in the distribution of commodities, the illusory belief arises that the source of injustice is to be located in the sphere of exchange, rather than in surplus value extraction. Making the sphere of circulation responsible for exploitation is thus a socially almost necessary illusion. Hatred of the Jews and hatred of the sphere of circulation participate in the same obfuscation that is necessarily generated by the system. Clausen, 2005. This is taken advantage of by anti-Semites who distinguish between, quote, productive, schaffendes, and, quote, usurious, and, quote, raffendes, capital. That is, between capital invested in the industrial sector of production and capital invested in the credit system of the commercial and financial sector. Quote, bourgeois anti-Semitism, end quote, Adorno and Horkheimer argue, quote, has a specific economic purpose, to conceal domination in production, end quote. Anti-Semitism and the dialectic of the process of subjectivation. The critical theory of anti-Semitism is based on an assumption that may appear to clash with, quote, healthy, end quote, common sense, namely that anti-Semitism, a scandalous thing to diligent liberals, in the end proved to function perfectly within an increasingly total form of capitalism. Here, Freud's diagnosis of the malaise or discontent in civilization is pertinent. Quote, Christ. One might speak of the claustrophobia of humanity in the administered world, of a feeling of being trapped in a completely socialized nexus, like a net. The thicker the net, the greater the desire to escape, but the more difficult escaping becomes. This reinforces the sense of anger felt towards civilization. The struggle against it becomes violent and irrational. End quote. Adorno. At this point, the theorization of anti-Semitism becomes crucial, because it helps to explain the increasingly impersonal and coercive character of sociality in terms that are relatively easy to assimilate. Believing he or she has identified the cause of social domination, personified in clearly recognizable figures, the anti-Semite assumes he or she can eliminate those recognizable figures by participating in the powerful anti-Semitic community. However, at the same time as naming and blaming alleged culprits, anti-Semitism repeats the operation by which oppressive structures underpinning practices of domination and exclusion are obfuscated or masked. For disadvantaged subjects, however, this does not diminish anti-Semitism's functional value. Having an explanation and a scapegoat makes the anguish of subjects at the mercy of all-pervasive and anonymous social forces more tolerable. After all, anti-Semitic frustration already has a target. Nevertheless, it ought to be pointed out that the social processes of integration, atomization, subjugation, and coercion affect not only anti-Semites but extend to everyone in society. Ultimately, anti-Semitic tendencies are rooted in the inertial forces of socialization. Footnote. Nietzsche had already observed the importance of being able to project blame upon a concrete agent. Quote, for every sufferer instinctively looks for a cause of his distress, more exactly, for a culprit, even more precisely for a guilt culprit who is receptive to distress. In short, for a living being upon whom he can release his emotions, actually or in effigy, on some pretext or other, because the release of emotions is the greatest attempt at relief, or, should I say, at anesthetizing on the part of the sufferer his involuntarily longed for narcotic against pain of any kind, end quote. Nietzsche. End footnote. In attempting to elucidate the causes of anti-Semitism, critical theorists found their main ally in Freudian psychoanalysis. Footnote. For a more detailed analysis of the relation between social theory and psychoanalysis, see Bach, 2018, Clausen, 1988, Dahmer, 2019, Maiso, 2013, Safatla, 2017, and Samora, 2007. End footnote. Their use of psychoanalysis, however, did not consist in directly analyzing the contents of anti-Semitism in the manner of Rudolf Löwenstein, 1952, or in speculation regarding the specific traits of the, quote, Jewish psyche, end quote. Inevitably, such uses of psychoanalysis led into the trap of psychologism. Such analyses regard anti-Semitism merely as an outcome, failing to take into account its psychodynamic basis in the individual subject, which is what makes analysis of its social dimension possible. A collaborator of Adorno and Horkheimer during the period of Californian exile, the psychoanalyst Otto Fenichel, struck at the heart of the matter, quote, since psychoanalysis is a method for the study and treatment of the psychic life of individuals, strictly speaking, there can only be a psychology of anti-Semites, not of anti-Semitism, end quote. Accordingly, critical theory and psychoanalysis converge in their analyses of processes of violence internalization, examining what it is that makes individuals more or less likely to identify with groups, actively participate in anti-Semitic offenses, or tacitly and passively condone such acts. The anti-Semitism of the fascist era thus appears to result from the coercive character of socialization in post-liberal societies, where the social apparatus weighs inexorably upon the individual, demanding the total subordination of internal and external life to social constraints. In these modes of socialization, weakened or damaged individuals are characterized by the experience of harm. Society imposes itself on the individual with such a degree of coercive violence that one can no longer speak of coherent personalities, but of individuals constituted as, quote, systems of scars, end quote. Yeah, that's fucking metal. Individuals sense that their lives are totally subordinate to a logic that they do not understand and before which they remain prostrate. The disproportionate gap between social power and individual impotence increases the volatility of the libidinal economy, leading to an all-pervasive anxiety and marked desire for security that crystallizes in what Fenichel termed, quote, narcissistic neediness, end quote. Such neediness encourages a search for, quote, phantasms and personifications with which dependent individuals attempt to rearticulate the abstract and impenetrable aspect of social relations in terms of lived experience, end quote. Adorno and Jarisch. Hatred of the Jew as the cause of all misfortune is thus one example of a magical formula designed to create an appearance of meaning or sense in an otherwise inexorable reality. Not only does it offer a concrete explanation of abstract harm and an escape valve for frustration, hatred of the Jew as the cause of all misfortune offers a critique of Not only does hatred of the Jew as the cause of all misfortune offer a concrete explanation of abstract harm and an escape valve for frustration, but hatred of the Jew as the cause of all misfortune also helps to further reinforce the subject's total social dependency and further mystify the causes of social coercion. In this context, the value of psychoanalysis is that psychoanalysis helps explain the mechanisms and performative role of the, quote, anti-Semitic illusion, end quote, in a psychic economy subordinate to the reality principle. Freud had shown that the ego, as the point at which internal and external reality converge, was not only the origin of knowledge but also the organ of repression and censorship and the defense mechanisms of the psyche. Freud's theory made it possible to access, quote, the dark subterranean side of history, end quote, that flourished in the destructive thirst for violence that National Socialism had normalized. A case of the fate of human instinct and passion when it is repressed and disfigured by civilization. Accordingly, Adorno states that critical theory is uninterested in psychoanalysis either as a form of ego psychology or social psychology. Instead, critical theory regards psychoanalysis as the psychology of the libido that always follows the path of least resistance in the struggle between the drives and the imperatives of adaptation. See Adorno, 1955. The psychological mechanism of anti-Semitism is to be interpreted from this standpoint. Having said this, for Adorno, the mechanism exceeds the psyche since, quote, anti-Semitism is not a matter of individual psychology, end quote. Rather, anti-Semitism is an attitude, a feeling that is, quote, linked to a contemporaneous awareness of power. Anti-Semitic situations are always those in which a demonstration of power must be addressed towards a weaker individual. They themselves arise under the pressure of power. In every respect, German anti-Semitism conveys the quality of having been induced in the subject, of threatening from on high that power may well turn against the subject, should the subject not also become an anti-Semite. End quote. Quote, anti-Semitic behavior is unleashed in situations in which blinded people, deprived of subjectivity, are let loose as subjects, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. At this point, the theme of, quote, tolerated excess, end quote, arises once more. In, quote, tolerated excess, end quote, the possibility of giving in to one's instincts and indulging in aggressive behavior not only does not endanger the subject who transgresses the norm, it may even perform a useful function for him. Expressing anti-Semitic attitudes helps compensate the wounded narcissism of weakened and impotent subjects, enabling them to feel that those weakened and impotent subjects are at once established and rebellious, both part of a majority and members of an elite. The weakened and impotent subject's invective amounts to a perversion of the ideal of civil liberty. The psychoanalyst Otto Finihel gave the idea consistency. Quote, human beings find themselves caught in the conflict between the inclination to rebel and the respect for authority which human beings have been educated. Anti-Semitism offers human beings the means of satisfying these two contradictory tendencies towards rebellion and respect for authority at the same time. The rebellious tendency through destructive actions against defenseless people, and the respectful tendency towards authority through obedient action in accordance with the preferences of the established powers, end quote. By this token, it is significant that research on the authoritarian personality revealed that the type of people most likely to engage in, quote, conformist rebellion, end quote, were precisely those who felt most aggrieved by the logic of society. It is the experience of injustice, feeling of having been cheated, that leads such subjects to demand that others should also swallow the same bitter pill. Formulating a physiognomy of their, quote, type, end quote, Adorno presented anti-Semites as, quote, people who suffer injustice in the social struggle for survival, but who, in their own way, identify with said competition. They are Darwinists. They believe in the survival of the fittest. They feel they are, quote, fitter, end quote, than the Jews, and believe that the Jews are naturally doomed to go under. When nature does not work as expected, those people who suffer injustice in the social struggle for survival, which is how he's characterizing anti-Semites here, lend nature a hand, end quote. Adorno. Certainly, as such reflections do not apply exclusively to anti-Semitism, they might also be applied to cases of violence against other social groups. This, however, stems from the fact the psychodynamics of what have come to be known as, quote, racial prejudice, end quote, is not based on the specific characteristics of the object against which hatred is directed, but on the realization that having such an object can serve as a useful outlet for the destructive impulses of some subjects, enabling those subjects to vent frustration without calling into question the primacy of the reality principle. Jews perform this function due to Jews perform this function due to Jews' ambivalent status, a status that enables Jews to embody a figure both of power and of pure impotence. Such ambivalence also encourages the projection of arguments that legitimize violence against Jews. Footnote. Some of these features, such as, quote, clannishness, end quote, aid rationalization. Others, such as the expression of weakness and masochism, provide psychologically adequate stimuli for destructiveness. There can be hardly any doubt that all these requirements are fulfilled by the phenomenon of the Jew. This is not to say that Jews must draw hatred upon themselves, or that there is an absolute historical necessity which makes them, rather than others, the ideal target of social aggressiveness. Suffice it to say that Jews can perform this function in the psychological households of many people. The problem of the, quote, uniqueness, end quote, of the Jewish phenomenon, and hence of anti-Semitism, could be approached only by recourse to a theory, of modern society as a whole. End quote, Adorno. End footnote. That whole footnote was a quote, but it didn't address itself as a quote until the end. Thus the supposed contents of, quote, anti-Semitic ideology, end quote, whether in allegations of natural inferiority or as shadowy architects of a global conspiracy, are pure rationalizations that have no intention of establishing any kind of truth content. They serve rather a psychic function whose main concern is to legitimize violence. Operating here is a mechanism of projection for, quote, those impelled by blind murderous lust have always seen in the victim the pursuer who has driven them to desperate self-defense. And the mightiest of the rich have experienced their weakest neighbor as an intolerable threat before falling upon him, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. This is the rationality that justifies allowing subjects to suspend self-control and give free rein to their destructive, violent, and even sadistic impulses. Understanding the logic of anti-Semitic violence means remaining conscious of the fact that, as Horkheimer pointed out, quote, the tendencies in people which make them susceptible to propaganda for terror are themselves the result of terror, physical and spiritual, actual and potential oppression, end quote. Horkheimer. It is this situation of pressure and menace that leads aggressors, as if by a fatal mechanism, to unleash on their victims what they themselves unconsciously fear above all else. Quote, no one who seeks shelter shall find shelter. Those who express what everyone craves, peace, homeland, freedom, will be denied it, just as nomads and traveling players have always been refused rights of domicile. Whatever someone fears, that is done to him, ... The evicted compulsively arouse the lust to evict them, bracket, from the graveyards where they are buried, end bracket. The marks left on them by violence endlessly inflame violence, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. If the social mechanism has branded them with the stigma of exclusion, then so the thinking goes, it is likely that the victims are not so innocent. This, even today, is the legitimating rationality behind calls for bloodshed by anti-Semites and xenophobes of all stripes. Pulsating in the background is the desire for self-assertion and the exercise of force. In this respect, anti-Semitism is not an anomalous deviation from the existing social order, but a demonstration of how social pressure negatively affects human beings and ensures the continual reproduction of persecution and violence. In a society characterized by blind and relentless coercion, marked by vast levels of discontent, individuals sense that violence is the governing principle of the existing order. Anti-Semitic denunciations are thus calls to aggression that allow dispossessed and resentful subjects to participate in actively inflicting the same social violence that they are normally obliged to endure. This is how the penultimate finishers in the race endow their position of privilege with a sense of reality vis-a-vis those finishing last. Indeed, quote, rage is vented on those who are both conspicuous and unprotected. And just as, depending on the constellation, the victims are interchangeable, vagrants, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, so each of them can replace the murderer in the same blind lust for killing, so soon as he feels the power of representing the norm, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Leaving, of course, the roots of the problem intact, it does allow for the externalization of accumulated aggression. In this way, anti-Semitism appears as a mobilization of the unconscious dynamics of the subject. These dynamics are subsequently channeled and adjusted to the imperatives of the reproduction of social power, wherein the latter takes advantage and exploits the demands of the libidinal economy. In Adorno's, quote, anti-Semitism is a mass medium, in the sense in which it appeals to emotions, conflicts, preferences, and unconscious tendencies, which it reinforces and manipulates instead of rendering them conscious and clarifying them, end quote. Anti-Semitism generates a cohesive power strong enough to bring together subjects who frequently feel isolated and misunderstood, offering them the longed-for feeling of, quote, community, end quote. Since it appeals to emotional needs, conflicts, and often primary and irrational dispositions, Adorno and Leo Löwenthal regard anti-Semitism as a kind of, quote, inverted psychoanalysis, end quote. But in doing so, anti-Semitism, quote, incessantly reinforces the defense mechanisms instead of working towards the defense mechanism's dissolution. Anti-Semitism plays capriciously with unconscious and preconscious elements instead of raising those unconscious and preconscious elements to consciousness, end quote. Anti-Semitism appeals to the wounded aspect of subjectivity and is seemingly assimilated to what Freud called a Schiefheilung, a, quote, crooked cure, end quote, for psychic conflicts that reestablishes a superficial equilibrium between the reality principle and the pleasure principle, often at the price of a flight from reality. Footnote: if anti-Semitism, this looks like a quote, if anti-Semitism is a, quote, symptom which fulfills a, quote, economic, end quote, function within the subject's psychology, one is led to postulate that this symptom is not simply, quote, there, end quote, as a mere expression of what the subject happens to be, but that it is the outcome of a conflict. It owes its very irrationality to psychological dynamics which force the individual, at least in certain areas, to abandon the reality principle, end quote. Adorno, 1950. End footnote. In fact, anti-Semitic behavior may mitigate discontent and anxiety by reducing the collateral friction within one's own psyche and finding an outlet for accumulated grievance. Nevertheless, it certainly does nothing to reduce the subject's position of weakness and dependence within the social order. In the words of Wolfram Stender, in the, quote, pseudo-logic, end quote, of anti-Semitism, quote, objective obfuscation and individual scarring come to constitute a stable short circuit, end quote. From this arises the need to specify the precise sense in which one can speak of anti-Semitism in terms of, quote, pathology, end quote, paranoia, perversion, etc. If it amounts to a, quote, crooked cure, end quote, then that obtains because instead of resulting in the social ostracization of anti-Semitic individuals, it allows anti-Semitic individuals to become more attuned to the prevailing norm, functioning as a kind of, quote, delusion, end quote, that makes it easier for them to meet the demands of adaptation and to internalize its costs. Footnote: this means that further reflection is needed on the relationship between individual and collective pathology, as well as on the latter's normalizing effect on the former, which would explain why only some subjects develop clinical symptoms. The, quote, pathic, end quote, projection is systematically mobilized by politics in such a way that, quote, the object of illness is determined in a way that conforms to reality, end quote. End quote, the system of delirium becomes a rational norm in the world, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. This is probably why Adorno and Horkheimer call the psychosocial mechanism of paranoid anti-Semitic projection pathic rather than pathological. Since the object is a social ailment that responds to the Freudian schema of, quote, culture and its discontents, end quote, it should not be interpreted according to the criteria of psychiatric doctrine. In Adorno's view, the Pathic designates the, quote, illness of the normal people, end quote, of those adapted to their times. End footnote. This is how anti-Semitism, charged with a destructive and violent pathos, can have a stabilizing function for the social order. For, quote, with false culprits, not only does real social conflict disappear, libidinal conflicts in adapted, quote, healthy, end quote, individuals also disappear, end quote. Stender, 1996. Ultimately, insofar as anti-Semitism is regarded as a, quote, prejudice, it would be unwise to assume that anti-Semitism can be defeated by superior argumentation or the refutation of anti-Semitism's premises. The crux of the matter lies in the way anti-Semitism, like racism, nationalism, or superstition, takes root in the psyche of anti-Semitism's subjects. Conscious of the obviously irrational nature of their prejudice, subjects state that they are simply expressing a, quote, opinion, end quote. This view of, quote, opinion, end quote, is symptomatic of a late liberal relativism that has renounced any concept of binding truth. Quote, insofar as everyone is allowed to think whatever they like regardless of whether what they think is true, for each individual thinks only of that which helps that individual to affirm themselves and gain a competitive advantage, end quote. Adorno. In this respect, anti-Semitism can help to orient individuals in a world perceived as alien and hostile, helping to relieve the subject of the arduous task of actually having to confront reality in a critical way. The claim is often made that Jews must have done something to have attracted so much hate over the years. Here, having a, quote, opinion, end quote, no longer represents an initial step towards independent knowledge, but plays a primarily psychological role. Quote, here, rather than restrict the hypothetical judgment, the, quote, opinion of the I, end quote, emphasizes it, end quote. In this context, quote, opinion, end quote, functions as an effectively charged means of self-affirmation. The subject thus resists anything that might disprove his or her, quote, opinions, end quote, by way of facts. Recognition of error would also mean inflicting a narcissistic injury upon the subject, something he or she could hardly tolerate. Combating anti-Semitic opinion means addressing the social logic that both debilitates subjects and encourages the psychic internalization of, quote, crooked cures, end quote. For, quote, what the subject attributes to himself in the name of opinion as a private prerogative is nothing other than the imprint of the objective situation in which the subject finds himself, end quote. As such, the complacent liberal conviction that, quote, normal, end quote, and considered opinions will always prevail over, quote, insane or, quote, pathological opinions can no longer be taken for granted. The problem is that the very need to resort to, quote, opinions, end quote, holding Jews responsible for every kind of evil, redressing grievances through collective narcissism, asserting the inferiority of certain ethnic or cultural characteristics, expresses precisely what is normal about the social logic. It is simply a normal way of processing the social logic's conflicts. Hence Adorno's conclusion, quote, if there really is no right life in the false, then there can be no right consciousness in the false either, end quote. Adorno. Anti-Semitism after Auschwitz. Critical theory's main argument is that individuals hope to find in anti-Semitism a palliative cure for the, quote, suffering generated by rationalized civilization, end quote. Clearly, the, quote, manifest contents, end quote, of anti-Semitic proclamations are absurd. Yet what determines the manifest contents of, Yet what determines anti-Semitic proclamations' plausibility is not whether those anti-Semitic proclamations correspond to the facts, but the extent to which those anti-Semitic proclamations help a wide array of subjects internalize the social imperatives of the day. As such, quote, what is considered, quote, pathological, end quote, today can become the dominant tendency tomorrow with the change in social conditions, end quote. Adorno. It only takes one U-turn in the socio-political climate to make what was hitherto taboo admissible once again. In the post-Nazi constellation, hatred of Jews could no longer be openly expressed once fascism's military defeat and news of the extermination of European Jewry re-established the taboo of one voicing such sentiment. Hence the bitter irony with which Adorno and Horkheimer begin their reflection. Quote, but there are no longer any anti-Semites. Anti-Semites are just liberals who want to express their anti-liberal opinions. Anti-Semites were just liberals who wanted to express their anti-liberal opinions, end quote. Under the new order regulating what can and cannot be said, anti-Semitism becomes crypto-anti-Semitism, a, quote, rumor about the Jews, end quote, Adorno, that can no longer be explicitly discussed. In this sense, Adorno points out how, quote, gossip, rumor, ... the opinion that is not openly expressed has always been the means of expression of the various kinds of discontent that dare not come to light in any given social order. Whoever expresses him or herself in forms of opinion and rumor right away gives the impression of belonging to a secret community of truth speakers whom the official institutions of society routinely oppress, end quote. Adorno. Whoever violates the social taboo is entitled to feel like a rebel. Here is someone with the courage to openly express the, quote, truth, end quote, that no one else dares to address. Undergirding such courage, however, is the certainty, the knowledge that freely expressing one's own, quote, opinion, end quote, will earn one the support of a compact social majority. After the Second World War, the reestablishment of the taboo had been designed to protect the vulnerable and tackle the indifference of a population that had acquiesced in extermination. For this reason, the rumor that revolts against the taboo vindicates both the harm inflicted and the very right to persecute, but without articulating itself openly. Hence Adorno's claim that the veiled insinuation, the illusion, quote, can often be more dangerous than the frank manifestation, end quote. The initiated will get the reference. From this results a climate of hostility perpetuated under the guise of, quote, democratic normality, end quote. One that clings to the expectation that a change in the balance of power may one day make open aggression fully, quote, respectable, end quote, again. Even in the 1950s and 1960s, precisely during the time of the, quote, economic miracles, end quote, critical theorists were well aware of the enormous fragility of the democratic regimes. In the social forms of advanced capitalism, democracy had barely managed to articulate itself at the formal level. At the material level, democracy failed completely. Proper democracy would presuppose and be based on truly autonomous individuals, a democracy prepared to be an individual prepared to be the subject of his or her own life. However, the social logic posed an obstacle to the possibility of making such progress from the outset. Added to this was the fact that the defeat of fascism in 1945 had only been achieved in military terms. The conditions that had made the rise of authoritarian and anti-Semitic dynamics possible were still very much in place, at least at the societal level. First, the tendency towards greater concentrations of capital persisted. This entailed not only further polarization between those who possessed social power and those who did not possess social power, but also the threat that many of the well-off, clinging to their status and privilege, would be declassed. However, despite rising levels of prosperity and full employment, an increase in the powers of production meant that increasing numbers of individuals were made to feel that they were not indispensable employees, but always potentially unemployed persons, that is, virtually superfluous to the social system. Hence Adorno's warning, quote, the more strongly our society becomes, quote, integral, end quote, a completely organized whole, the greater the pressure our society exerts on the relatively powerless individual. And it is precisely this process that reinforces the defensive mechanisms associated with prejudice. It is conceivable that even the most appalling form of discrimination, the Nazi policy of genocide, is closely linked to the fact that the present form of economic organization proves incapable of guaranteeing the reproduction of the population living under such conditions. End quote, Adorno. For as long as this sort of pressure and latent anguish persists, social life will retain a destructive potential that can detonate at any moment. This is what informs Adorno's view, stated as late as 1967, that, quote, as far as the state of consciousness and unconsciousness of human beings is concerned, end quote, the possibility that an event like Auschwitz might repeat itself could not be ruled out. For, quote, barbarism endures to the extent that the conditions that gave rise to the collapse remain in place. That is the entire horror. Despite the invisibility of the danger today, social pressure continues to exert its gravitational pull, dragging humans toward the unspeakable that culminated in Auschwitz at the level of universal history. End quote, Adorno. Auschwitz is understood here as the culmination of a process rather than an isolated event. The roots of extermination are to be found in specific and social historical conditions that pave the way for the various forms of violence, exclusion, and barbarism that reached their most inhumane and brutal expression in Auschwitz. Socialized individuals suffer under such conditions, however. They learn to live with them. Hence the need to understand how the current conditions of socialization produce, quote, normal monsters, end quote, Adorno. That is, not only frustrated subjects seeking an outlet for aggressive impulses, but also those who are fully integrated within their social environment, those who have hardened, become cold, who divide the world into friends and enemies and are willing to do anything to achieve their goals. As long as this logic of subjectivation endures, the impotence of the only thing capable of stopping the excesses of anti-Semitic aggression, or the baleful logic of prejudice will persist. Quote, reflection meaning ultimately truth. The infantile hobby of murder confirms the closed life to which one must adapt oneself. End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Until this situation changes, all genuine solidarity with the persecuted outsiders and misfits will have to be articulated against the grain. Thanks for listening.